In the boardroom on the 41st floor of the Sterling Urban Group headquarters in Canary Wharf, Victoria Hale laughed when I, clad in my worn coat, said I wanted to make a phone call. She leaned back in her leather chair, her eyes sharp with amusement. "Call whoever you want," she said. The room laughed with her. I dialed. 2 seconds later, a voice came through the speaker, and Victoria Hale froze mid-breath. The smile disappeared because the person on the other end of that line was not someone she could dismiss. I had not always worn a coat with fraying seams. There was a time, not so long ago really, when I sat in boardrooms not unlike this one, reviewing budgets and shaking hands with local officials. I had spent 22 years running the Bermondsey Community Development Alliance, turning abandoned lots into affordable housing and negotiating with landlords who saw tenants as mere line items. I was good at it, good enough that people trusted me with their futures. But trust, like money, has a way of disappearing when the wrong things happen at the wrong time. A failed investment wiped out my savings. A legal dispute with a former partner drained what was left. By the time the dust settled, I was 64 years old with nothing but a pension check and a modest flat in Bermondsey Row, the same neighborhood I had once helped build up from nothing. I did not feel sorry for myself. That was not the kind of man I was. I simply started over, smaller. Bermondsey Row was not a place that appeared on investor pitch decks or city tourism brochures. It was a cluster of aging brick buildings in South London where the rent was low and the hallways smelled of old carpet and cooking oil. 14 residents still lived in the block at 22 Marlow Street, mostly elderly, mostly alone, mostly people who had run out of places to go. I knew every one of them by name. I knew that Mrs. Gladys Bourne on the 3rd floor had lived there for 19 years and kept a small garden on her windowsill because it reminded her of her late husband. I knew that Raymond Whitby on the 2nd floor was a retired steel worker whose knees were too bad for stairs, but who refused to complain about it. They were not just tenants, they were neighbors. And when the eviction notice arrived, printed on thick corporate letterhead with the Sterling Urban Group logo embossed in silver, I was the one they turned to. The notice was clean, professional, and final. Sterling Urban Group had acquired the building through a legal purchase from the previous landlord. All permits for demolition had been approved by the local council. Residents had 30 days to vacate. The language was polite, the way a surgeon's explanation is polite before cutting. Everything was in order. There was nothing illegal about it. That was the part that made it worse. I did what I had always done. I followed the process. I drafted a formal letter to Sterling Urban Group's headquarters requesting a meeting to discuss relocation options for the residents. The letter was respectful, clearly written, and supported by documentation of each tenant's circumstances. I sent it by recorded delivery. 2 weeks passed, no response. I called the company's development division 4 times. The first call was transferred to a voicemail box that was full. The second call reached an assistant who promised someone would follow up. No one did. The third and fourth calls were not returned at all. I was not angry. I understood how large organizations worked, but I also understood what silence meant. I attended a Southwark Council session, sitting in the back row for 3 hours while councillors discussed zoning variances and commercial tax incentives. When public comment opened, I stood and spoke for exactly 3 minutes, the maximum allowed. I described the situation at 22 Marlow Street. I asked whether the council had any obligation to ensure displaced residents received adequate transition support. The council chair thanked me for my comments and moved to the next item on the agenda. No follow-up, no questions, just a polite nod and a shift of attention, the way you acknowledge a stranger's sneeze on a bus. I visited the legal aid office in the city centre. A young solicitor reviewed the documents and told me what I already suspected. Sterling Urban Group had followed every applicable law. The purchase was legitimate, the demolition permits were valid, the eviction timeline met the statutory minimum. There was no cause of action. The solicitor looked genuinely sorry when she said it. I thanked her and left. I stood on the pavement outside the legal aid office for a long time, watching traffic pass, thinking about what options remained. There were not many. Every legitimate door had been opened, walked through, and quietly closed behind me. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a decision I had been avoiding. I knew the Right Honourable Sir Adrian Cole's telephone number by heart. I had known it for decades, but I had never dialed it for something like this. Sir Adrian Cole was one of the most powerful political figures in the country. I had known him since before the title, before the campaigns, before the fundraising dinners and hotel ballrooms. We had grown up in the same neighbourhood. Adrian had once lived 4 streets from Bermondsey Row, back when it was just a place where working families tried to make ends meet. I had helped Adrian's family once, years ago, when they were about to lose their flat. It was not something either of us talked about publicly. It was simply a fact that existed between us, quiet and unchanged. I had never asked Adrian for a favor, not once in 40 years. I believed that relationships should not be transactional, that a good deed should not become a debt, and I had no intention of changing that belief. Now, what I wanted was not a political intervention. What I wanted was a conversation, a real one, face to face with the person who held the power to change things. I wanted to give Victoria Hale the chance to make the right decision on her own, not because a senior politician pressured her, but because she understood what was at stake. I called a friend that night, a man named Donald Prentice, someone I had known since my days at the Bermondsey Alliance. Donald asked me what the plan was. I told him I was going to walk into Sterling Urban Group's headquarters and request a 60-day extension for the residents. Donald asked what would happen if she said no. I was quiet for a moment, then said something that Donald would remember for a long time. I want to give her the chance to do the right thing because it is her choice, not because someone forced her hand. Donald told me I was either the most principled man alive or the most stubborn. I said I would accept either description. The next morning, I put on my coat and took the bus across town to Canary Wharf. The Sterling Urban Group headquarters was a glass tower that caught the morning sun like a mirror. I stood outside for a moment, looking up at it. I had spent my life working in small offices with bad lighting and second-hand furniture, advocating for people who could not afford solicitors. This building was a different world entirely. I walked through the lobby past the security desk and told the receptionist I was there to see Victoria Hale. The receptionist looked at my coat, then at my face, and asked if I had an appointment. I did not. She told me that Ms. Hale's schedule was fully booked. I nodded and said I would wait. I sat in one of the lobby chairs, the kind designed to look expensive rather than feel comfortable, and waited for 2 hours without moving. Eventually, someone from the executive floor came down and escorted me to the 41st floor. Not out of respect, but out of curiosity, and perhaps because a 68-year-old man sitting motionless in a corporate lobby for 2 hours tends to make receptionists nervous. The boardroom was large, cold, and smelled of leather and recirculated air. Victoria Hale sat at the head of a long table with 2 associates flanking her. She was 42 years old, sharp-featured, and carried herself with the kind of stillness that comes from years of being the most powerful person in every room she entered. She had built Sterling Urban Group from nothing, no inheritance, no family connections, no safety net. Everything she had earned through calculation, discipline, and an unwillingness to let sentiment interfere with strategy. She did not know me. She did not know Bermondsey Row. To her, 22 Marlow Street was a line on a spreadsheet. Acquisition cost, demolition timeline, projected return. I sat across from her and made my case. I asked for 60 days, not a cancellation, not a reversal, just time enough for 14 people to find new places to live, to pack up decades of their lives, to leave with some measure of dignity. I spoke calmly and clearly, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed nothing, because the truth does not require rehearsal. Victoria listened. Her expression did not change. When I finished, she responded without hesitation. The project at 22 Marlow Street had already secured full financing through a private equity consortium, Victoria explained. The demolition contractor had been scheduled. The architectural firm had completed design revisions. All 7 municipal permits had been reviewed, approved, and filed. The construction timeline was locked to a 24-month delivery window, and every week of delay would cost Sterling Urban Group approximately £340,000 in holding fees, contractor penalties, and interest adjustments. She recited these figures without checking any notes. She did not need to. Victoria Hale had built her entire career on knowing the numbers before anyone else in the room, and she knew these numbers the way most people know their own telephone number, automatically, without effort, without doubt. She looked at me the way someone looks at a photograph of a place they have never been, with polite, distant recognition that the thing exists, but no emotional connection to it. She told me she understood my concern. She told me that relocation assistance had been offered through the standard channels. She told me that Sterling Urban Group had complied with every legal requirement and that the 30-day notice exceeded the statutory minimum by a full week. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply precise, the way a clock is precise. It delivered information without warmth and without cruelty, because warmth and cruelty were both inefficiencies she had trained herself to eliminate. One of her associates, a man named Graham Holbrook, mid-30s, tailored suit, the kind of face that had never once been told no in a job interview, shifted in his seat and offered a thin smile. He added that Sterling Urban Group's legal team had reviewed the matter thoroughly and found no basis for any modification to the existing timeline. He said it in the tone of someone closing a file. The other associate, a woman named Patricia York, nodded in agreement and mentioned that the company had an excellent track record with community transitions. She used the word transition the way airlines use the word turbulence, as a way of making something unpleasant sound routine. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not appeal to their emotions because I understood that emotions were not the currency of this room. When they finished, I sat with my hands folded on the table and looked at Victoria Hale with an expression that was neither defeated nor defiant. It was something else entirely, something closer to clarity. I had come here to offer her a chance, and she had declined it. I had expected that she might. I had prepared for it, but I had also hoped, somewhere beneath the preparation, that she would surprise me. She did not. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and pulled out my telephone. It was an older model, scratched along the edges, the kind of telephone that people in this building would have replaced years ago. I held it calmly, the way a man holds a tool he has used many times. "If that is your decision," I said, "then I would like to make one phone call, if you will allow me that courtesy." My voice carried no threat, no drama, no edge. It was a simple request spoken the way someone might ask to open a window. Victoria Hale tilted her head slightly. The corner of her mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. The kind of expression that appears on a person's face when they believe they have already won and are now merely watching the losing side go through the motions. She glanced at Graham Holbrook, who returned a look of casual amusement. Then she looked back at me and let the smile arrive fully. "Call whoever you want," she said. The words came out light, almost generous, as if she were granting permission to a guest to use the restroom. Graham Holbrook let out a short breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh, but close enough. Patricia York looked down at her notes to hide her own expression. The room had the energy of people watching something predictable unfold. An old man reaching for his last futile gesture before being politely escorted out. I placed the telephone on the conference table and dialed a number from memory. I did not scroll through contacts. I did not search. I simply pressed the digits one after another with the certainty of someone who had carried this number in his head for decades but had never used it for something like this. Then I pressed the speaker button. The telephone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a voice answered. It was a man's voice, deep, measured, immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever watched a parliamentary debate or attended a political fundraiser in this country. The voice said, "Reginald, I have been expecting your call." The room changed. It did not change the way rooms change in films, with dramatic music or sudden gasps. It changed the way temperature changes when a door opens in winter, quietly, completely. Graham Holbrook's smile disappeared first. Patricia York looked up from her notes, and Victoria Hale, who had not shifted her posture once during the entire meeting, sat forward in her chair for the first time. The Right Honourable Sir Adrian Cole's voice filled the boardroom through the small, scratched speaker of my telephone. Victoria knew that voice. She had heard it at fundraising galas where plates cost £5,000 each. She had heard it at policy summits where corporate leaders competed for 30 seconds of his attention. She had once spent an entire evening at a government reception trying to secure a brief introduction to him, and now that voice was coming through the telephone of a man she had just dismissed, sitting in her boardroom, calling him by his first name. Sir Adrian Cole did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He did not reference legislation or regulatory power or media exposure. He simply said one thing, and it landed on the table like a stone dropped into still water. "Victoria," he said, using her first name as though they were already acquainted. "Do you know how many doors Mr. Thorne knocked on before he called me?" Victoria did not answer. She could not, because she did not know. She had never asked. It had never occurred to her to ask. The minister continued. He spoke without urgency, laying out each fact the way a bricklayer sets stones, one at a time, level and deliberate. A formal letter sent by recorded delivery to her company, no response. 4 calls to the development division, each one ignored. A 3-hour Southwark Council session where I spoke for 3 minutes and was politely forgotten. A visit to legal aid that ended with the confirmation that the law offered no protection. Every legitimate channel tried and exhausted, one after another, in order, with patience. "He did not call me first," the minister said. "He called me last, and the only reason he called me at all is because every other door was closed. I want you to sit with that for a moment." The line went quiet. Sir Adrian Cole did not hang up. He simply let the silence do its work. Victoria looked at me. She looked at me differently now, not with the distant, clinical gaze she had used before, but with something closer to recognition. Not sympathy, not guilt, the slow, uncomfortable realization that she had made an assumption about me the moment I walked in. And that assumption had been wrong. She had seen the coat, she had seen the age, she had seen the request, and she had filed me away in a category that did not require further thought. But I was not a man who belonged in that category. I was a man who had spent his life doing exactly what she claimed to value: building things, solving problems, serving communities. I had walked into her building not out of desperation, but out of principle, and she had laughed at me. Graham Holbrook was staring at the telephone on the table as if it had changed shape. Patricia York had stopped writing entirely. The room that had felt so certain 5 minutes ago now felt like a place where something had shifted beneath the floor. Not enough to cause a collapse, but enough to make everyone question whether they were standing on solid ground. Victoria felt it most of all. She had spent 2 decades building an identity around the idea that she was not just successful, but fair. She told herself, and told others in interviews and keynote speeches and investor meetings, that Sterling Urban Group was different from other developers, that they considered communities, not just returns, that they built for the future without ignoring the present. It was the story she told herself every morning and every night. The story that separated her from the kind of people she had grown up watching: landlords who treated tenants like furniture, executives who signed displacement orders without looking up from their lunch. But sitting across from me, with Sir Adrian Cole's voice still lingering in the air, Victoria felt the edges of that story begin to curl. She had not read my letter. She had not returned my calls. She had approved the demolition timeline without ever once asking what would happen to the people still living inside the building. Not because she was cruel, but because she had not thought about it, and that, she was beginning to understand, might be worse. The image she had constructed of herself, a leader who was tough but fair, ambitious but principled, was still there, but it was no longer seamless. A question had entered it, thin as a hairline fracture, and she could not unask it. Had she become the very thing she had always promised herself she would not become? Had she spent so long looking at spreadsheets and timelines and profit margins that she had stopped seeing the people behind the numbers? She did not have an answer. And, for a woman who had built her life on always having answers, that was the most unsettling thing of all. She had a choice. She could hold her ground, absorb whatever political pressure came from the minister's involvement, and proceed with the project exactly as planned. The numbers supported it. The law supported it. Her board would support it. Or she could do something she had almost never done in 20 years of business: change her mind. Not because someone had forced her to, not because the mathematics had changed, but because she had finally looked at something she had been choosing not to see. Victoria lifted her eyes from the table and looked directly at me. Then she turned to Graham Holbrook and told him to call the legal department. She wanted an amendment drafted to the project timeline, a 60-day extension on the demolition schedule for 22 Marlowe Street. The instruction came out clean and sharp, the same tone she used for every business decision she had ever made. There was no tremor in her voice, no theatrical moment of surrender. She was not performing a change of heart. She was issuing an order. Graham opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Patricia York, who looked back at him with an expression that clearly communicated she was not going to be the one to argue. Graham asked if Victoria was sure. She told him she was not asking for his opinion on her certainty. She was giving him an instruction. He nodded once and reached for his telephone. Then Victoria turned back to me and spoke directly, without softening her tone or adding unnecessary warmth. The 60-day extension would hold. During that period, Sterling Urban Group would provide transitional housing support for all 14 residents, not through a generic referral to council services, but through a dedicated relocation coordinator hired and paid for by the company. She would also establish a relocation assistance fund financed entirely by the corporation to cover moving costs, security deposits, and up to 3 months of rent differential for any resident who ended up in a more expensive unit. It would not be a charitable gesture wrapped in a press release. It would be a structural commitment, documented and enforceable. I listened without interrupting, the same way I had listened when she told me no. My expression did not shift into gratitude or relief. I simply absorbed what she was saying, processing each point with the attention and care of a man who had spent his life measuring the distance between promises and actions. When she finished, I nodded once. It was a small motion, but it carried the weight of someone who understood that the real test of this commitment would not happen in this room. It would happen in the weeks that followed, in telephone calls and paperwork and flats that had yet to be found. Victoria then said something that surprised everyone at the table, including herself. She asked me to participate in the transition process, not as a consultant, not as a figurehead, but as a partner. Someone who knew the residents, understood their circumstances, and could ensure that the company's commitments translated into real outcomes on the ground. She told me that Sterling Urban Group had expertise in development finance and construction, but it clearly lacked something else. She did not name what that something was. She did not need to. I considered the offer. I did not accept immediately because I was not the kind of man who made decisions in the heat of a moment, even a good moment. I told Victoria that I would need to speak with the residents first because any decision about their lives should involve their voices. Victoria agreed. It was a small exchange, a few sentences, a few seconds, but it marked the exact point where the relationship between us shifted from opposition to something that might, with effort and honesty, become cooperation. Sir Adrian Cole's voice came through the telephone one final time. He thanked Victoria for her decision and told her that he looked forward to seeing the results. His tone was not congratulatory. It was measured, the same way it had been from the beginning. He was not celebrating a victory. He was acknowledging a beginning. Then the line disconnected and the telephone screen went dark on the conference table. Graham Holbrook stood and excused himself to make the calls Victoria had instructed. Patricia York gathered her notes and followed him out. The boardroom emptied until only Victoria and I remained, sitting across from each other at the long table. The glass walls of the 41st floor framed the London skyline behind us, towers and cranes and construction sites stretching to the horizon, the machinery of growth that never stops moving. Victoria did not apologize. I did not ask her to. We both understood that an apology in this context would have been too easy, too neat, a way of closing a door that needed to stay open. What had happened in this room was not a resolution. It was a fracture in something Victoria had believed about herself. And fractures do not heal because someone says the right words. They heal because someone does the work, day after day, even when no one is watching. I stood, pushed my chair back, and extended my hand. Victoria took it. The handshake was brief, firm, and unremarkable. It was not the kind of handshake that ends a story. It was the kind that begins a negotiation. I placed my telephone back in the inside pocket of my coat and walked out of the boardroom, through the executive corridor, past the lift bank, and into the lobby where I had sat for 2 hours that morning. The receptionist watched me leave without saying a word. I stepped through the glass doors and onto the pavement of Canary Wharf, where the afternoon sun reflected off the tower behind me and cast long shadows across the concrete. I took the bus back to Bermondsey Row. The ride took 40 minutes. I spent it looking out the window, watching the city transition from glass and steel to brick and asphalt, from buildings that touched the sky to buildings that leaned slightly under the weight of their own age. When I arrived at 22 Marlow Street, the building was still there, unchanged, unremarkable, the kind of structure that most people walk past without noticing, but it was still standing, and it would stand for at least 60 more days. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and knocked on Mrs. Gladys Bourne's door. She opened it, and behind her on the windowsill, her small garden caught the last light of the afternoon. I told her what had happened. She listened, and when I finished, she asked if it was real, if the company would actually do what it had promised. I told her I believed it was, but that I intended to make sure. That was the difference between hope and certainty, and I had never been comfortable relying on one when the other was available. Down the hall, I knocked on Raymond Whitby's door. Raymond answered slowly, leaning against the frame the way he always did when his knees were giving him trouble. I told him the same thing I had told Mrs. Bourne. Raymond listened, then asked a question I had not expected. He asked whether Victoria Hale had meant it, not the money, not the timeline, but the part about wanting me involved. I thought about it for a moment and said I believed she had, because it was the one thing she said that cost her something to say. Raymond nodded at that, as if it made sense in a way that the rest of it did not. The building at 22 Marlow Street would eventually come down. That had not changed. The land had been purchased, the permits had been filed, and the economics of the project had not disappeared because one meeting went differently than planned. What had changed was that 14 people would leave on their own terms, with time to find new places, with support to make the transition, and with the knowledge that someone had fought for them, not with threats or lawsuits, but with patience, principle, and a telephone call I had spent 40 years trying not to make. And somewhere on the 41st floor of a glass tower in Canary Wharf, Victoria Hale stood at the window of the empty boardroom and looked at the city she had spent 20 years reshaping. She had always believed that power was measured by what you could build. She was beginning to understand that it might also be measured by what you were willing to hear, and from whom, before it was too late. She had laughed when I asked to make a phone call. She would not make that mistake again. Not because she feared the person on the other end of the line, but because she had finally learned that the person sitting across the table deserved more than laughter. And before you say, call whoever you want, make sure you have already done the right thing, even when no one is making you. As I returned to my quiet flat in Bermondsey Row after that extraordinary meeting at the Sterling Urban Group headquarters in Canary Wharf, a powerful life lesson settled deeply in my heart, one that I hope will touch yours with the same emotion it stirs in me. In a world where success is often measured by towering glass structures and bottom lines, I learned that true strength lies in humility and the courage to listen to those we might otherwise overlook. Having knocked on every door in Southwark Council and beyond for the sake of my neighbours at 22 Marlow Street, like the gentle Mrs. Gladys Bourne and steadfast Raymond Whitby, I chose not to demand but to invite Victoria Hale to see the human faces behind her plans. Her initial laughter at my request to make a phone call revealed how easily we dismiss others based on appearances, yet it also opened the door to real change, showing that even the mightiest can soften when confronted with quiet principle rather than force. This experience taught me that power is not just about building empires, but about preserving dignity and community, reminding us all that before we laugh or say, call whoever you want, we must first do what is right, for every person deserves respect and a chance to be heard. It fills me with profound gratitude and a quiet hope for a kinder society. If my story has resonated with you and moved you to reflect on your own encounters with compassion, please share your thoughts in the comments below and do subscribe to this channel to receive more inspiring tales of resilience and redemption from ordinary lives.